Science has taught us some incredible things, but it's also disproven a lot of scary stuff. Here are 20 shocking things people believed before science that will make you glad we stopped doing those things. Number 20. The Earth is flat. If you're watching this video right now, there's a good chance you already know that the Earth isn't flat. It's a sphere. But did you know it wasn't that long ago that pretty much everyone on the planet believed the Earth was flat? It wasn't until the age of exploration, when people like Christopher Columbus and Ferdinand Magellan sailed around the globe, that it became apparent to most of the world that the Earth was, in fact, round. Even though commoners didn't understand how the Earth could be round. If they lived on a flat plane, that didn't stop them from believing it, and the truth is, it's hard to blame them, since many scientists back in their day agreed with the flat Earth theory. But eventually, as more and more people traveled around the world, evidence started piling up. You can't argue with what you can actually see. So finally, the world slowly came to accept that the Earth is indeed a sphere. 19. People believed humans could spontaneously burst into flames. Spontaneous human combustion, or the idea that someone could burst into flames without any outside source of ignition, seems like something out of a horror movie. But believe it or not, this was a widely held belief for centuries. While you may think people would have stopped believing in this when someone proved it couldn't be done, it turns out it was quite difficult to disprove. For one thing, if someone did burst into flames, it wouldn't leave behind any evidence, so you wouldn't be able to analyze what had happened. Additionally, the first person who tried to disprove spontaneous human combustion probably got burned alive while trying to do it. As gross as it sounds, it wasn't until the 18th century, when people started gaining an understanding of fire safety and the basic principles of physics, that the world finally put this one to rest. Number 18. The TMIC Model, or geocentric model of the universe. This is the idea that the Earth was the center of the universe. Basically, everything revolved around the Earth. This was a theory proposed by astronomer Ptolemy in the 2nd century AD, but it turns out he wasn't alone in his thinking. Many other cultures throughout history believed the same thing. For example, the Babylonians, Greeks, and indigenous peoples of the Americas all believed the Earth was the center of the universe. However, as time went on, scientific development proved otherwise. Of course, these days, thanks to modern science, we know that our sun is just one star in the Milky Way galaxy, and that there are billions of other stars out there, many of which are likely orbited by planets. We've even discovered exoplanets orbiting stars that are hundreds of light years away. So clearly, the Earth isn't anywhere close to being the center of the universe. Number 17. Bloodletting heals all illnesses. Doctors used to bleed their patients to cure everything, from headaches to heart disease. This practice of bloodletting had been used for centuries. They believed it helped to balance the 4 humors, or types of fluid in the body. These humors were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Back then, doctors thought that every illness was caused by an imbalance of these 4 humors. To treat your symptoms, they needed to get rid of some of the blood, inducing sweating, vomiting, or diarrhea. Bloodletting was often carried out using leeches, or by having the patient sleep with their head hung over a bowl so they would cough up blood. Yikes. Nowadays, we know that bloodletting doesn't cure anything. In fact, it can be deadly. If you remove too much blood from a person's body, they could go into shock and die. 16. That for fluids or humors controlled your personality and health. Like we mentioned earlier, bloodletting was based on the idea that people had for humors or fluids in their body. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Not only did they believe that diseases were caused by an imbalance of these fluids, but they also thought that these humors determined your personality type. Some believed that hot and cold temperatures determined the type of humor you had. So if you had a fever, you might have a hot and fiery personality. Or if you were constantly sick and tired, you probably had a cold and sluggish personality. How accurate is that? 15. That bad smells cause disease, not germs. Before we learned about germs, people believed that bad smells caused disease. This is known as the miasma theory. People believed that bad smells or miasma could enter the body through the mouth, nose, or open wounds and cause illness. In the Middle Ages, people believed that the air in cities was full of miasma, which is why some people even wore flower petals or perfume to try to mask their body odor, which they thought was causing them to get sick. Eventually, however, people began to realize that poor hygiene, not bad smells, was the real culprit behind disease. Number 14. That left-handed people were evil or cursed. This superstition was common in many different cultures throughout history. For example, in Germany, it was believed that left-handed people were more likely to be witches. In some countries, it was believed that left-handed people were more likely to be in league with the devil. These superstitions likely stemmed from the fact that most people were right, so anything different or outside the norm was viewed with suspicion. However, there's no evidence to support this claim. In fact, it was probably just a coincidence that there weren't many lefties back in the day, since studies show that roughly 10% of the world's population is left-handed today. Number 13. Tomatoes were poisonous. When tomatoes first came to Europe in the 16th century, they were thought to be poisonous. This is because they were part of the nightshade family, and deadly nightshade was known for its poisonous berries. Plus, tomatoes looked similar to deadly nightshade, so it made sense that people would assume they were poisonous too. However, it turned out that tomatoes were safe to eat, and eventually they became a popular addition to the Mediterranean diet. But it wasn't until the 1800s that people finally accepted them in the United States. Since the US was settled much later than Europe, Native Americans were already familiar with tomatoes and knew they weren't poisonous. But when Europeans arrived, they brought their superstitions with them. So it wasn't until the tomato finally caught on in the US that people stopped fearing it. 12. That the moon affected mental illness. The moon has been blamed for a lot of things throughout history, from controlling the tides to affecting the behavior of animals. But did you know that it was also believed to affect people? 2. Specifically, it was thought to be responsible for mental illness. In fact, the word lunacy actually comes from the Latin word lunaris, which means of the moon. This was the prevailing belief for centuries, and asylums for the mentally ill were often built far away from cities and towns so that the moon's rays wouldn't reach them and cause a disturbance. Of course, nowadays, we know that the moon doesn't have any effect on people's behavior. Number 11. That witches caused crop failure or sickness. Ever heard of the expression to put a curse on someone? Well, it turns out that people have been blaming witches for everything from crop failure to illness for centuries. In fact, it was estimated that between 1450 and 1750, more than 100,000 people were accused of witchcraft, with most of them being women. The reason for this is twofold. First of all, women were often seen as outsiders in society, and anytime there's a natural disaster, people tend to look for someone to blame. And since women weren't typically involved in religious or political life, they were easy targets. Secondly, many of the symptoms of illness, such as fever and convulsions, were attributed to witchcraft. So if someone was sick, they were often treated as if they were a witch. 10. That diseases were punishments from gods. Throughout most of human history, people didn't have a scientific understanding of disease. So when epidemics struck, they believed it was because the gods were angry at humanity. For example, the Black Death, which killed millions of people in the 14th century, was seen as a punishment from God for the sins of man. Similarly, when smallpox ravaged Native American populations in the 16th century, it was blamed on the wrath of the gods. However, nowadays, we know that diseases are caused by viruses and bacteria, not divine intervention. 9. That seas boiled near the equator. One of the biggest mysteries of the world for early sailors was what lay beyond the horizon. They had never seen the curvature of the earth, since they lived on such a small part of it. But they knew that somewhere out there, the world ended. And if you've ever wondered what the edge of the world might look like, you might be surprised to learn that sailors believed it was a terrifying sight. They thought that the world ended at the equator where the sun was hottest. And instead of rolling into another land or ocean, the ground fell off and landed in a fiery abyss. To make matters worse, they believed that sometimes the sea near the equator boiled, presumably from all the heat coming from the center of the earth. So if you were sailing near the equator and the water started boiling, you should probably get out of there quick, since you were dangerously close to the edge of the world and falling into a volcano. 8. That lightning was a sign of God's fighting. One of the scariest natural phenomena early humans witnessed was lightning. When you don't understand something, it's easy to get swept up in superstitious beliefs, and lightning was no exception. In fact, across the globe, there are countless myths and legends about lightning, almost all of which involve the gods. For example, in Greek mythology, lightning was Zeus's way of expressing his power and anger. Meanwhile, Norse mythology said that Thor used his hammer to create thunder and lightning. Even in China, people believe that lightning was created by the dragon god. Clearly, there's no shortage of mythical creatures that people have blamed for lightning. But nowadays, thanks to science, we know that lightning is simply a discharge of electricity in the atmosphere. 7. That sleeping near plants at night would kill you. Scientists didn't always have a good understanding of the world around them. Take, for example, their views on plants. People believed that plants released a deadly poison at night that could kill you. They also thought that if you slept in a room with plants, you would suffocate from the lack of oxygen. These beliefs likely stemmed from a misunderstanding of how plants work. Since we didn't know about photosynthesis or carbon dioxide, we just saw plants as creepy things that took up space and breathed in fresh air. Which isn't true, by the way. Plants don't breathe in oxygen, and they definitely don't release poison at night. But you know what they do? They absorb carbon dioxide and release oxygen, which is probably why some people felt like they could barely breathe when sleeping in a room with plants. Ironically, people believed they were suffocating from the lack of oxygen, when really, they were experiencing carbon dioxide poisoning. Number 6. That tobacco was the cure for all. It seems like just yesterday that people were putting tobacco in everything, chewing it, smoking it, even putting it in their toothpaste. And even though they still do those things today, back in the olden times, People believed that tobacco could cure everything from asthma to toothaches. In fact, tobacco was prescribed by doctors for all sorts of ailments. They thought that it could help with digestion, relieve pain, and even cure respiratory infections. But it wasn't until the 1900s, when research started showing the negative effects of tobacco, that people started cutting back on it. Nowadays, we know that tobacco is deadly and can cause cancer, heart disease, and stroke. So I guess it's a good thing that people finally stopped putting it in everything. 5. That women's wombs wandered inside the body. Back in the Middle Ages, people didn't really understand female anatomy. So when women complained of cramps or other symptoms related to their reproductive organs, they were told that their wandering womb was to blame. This is actually a real medical theory that was popular in the 1800s. It was called hysteria, and it was thought that a woman's uterus could leave her body and travel around inside her, causing all sorts of physical and psychological problems. Talk about a wild theory. However, thankfully, it's just that, a theory. Nowadays, we know that a woman's womb doesn't wander around her body, and that there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for everything from cramps to 4. That cursed objects or relics could harm or heal you. Ever heard of a voodoo doll? Well, believe it or not, the concept of cursed objects or relics goes back thousands of years. In fact, there are countless stories of people being harmed or healed by objects that were supposedly cursed. For example, there's the legend of the Hope Diamond, which is said to be cursed. Anyone who owns the diamond is doomed to a life of misery and bad luck. There's also the story of the monkey's paw, which is said to grant wishes, but always with a twist. However, nowadays, we know that cursed objects aren't real. It's all just a bunch of superstitious nonsense. 3. That hair continued to grow after death. Have you ever heard the phrase that someone's hair stood on end? Well, believe it or not, people used to believe that it was possible for someone's hair to literally stand on end. And not just while they were alive, but after they died, too. They believed that when someone died, their hair would continue to grow, and eventually it would become so long that it would start standing on end. This is because people didn't understand basic biology. They believed that after someone died, their body continued to grow, but in a weird, unnatural way. Nowadays, we know that hair stops growing when someone dies, but it does shrink as the person loses weight, which makes it seem like the hair is standing on end. Number 2. That dinosaurs were the bones of giants or dragons. When paleontologists started discovering dinosaur fossils in the 1800s, they didn't know what to make of them. After all, they had never seen anything like it before. So they started making up stories about what they found. Some said that dinosaurs were the bones of giants, while others said they were the remains of dragons. However, nowadays, we know the truth. Dinosaurs were once living, breathing creatures that roamed the earth millions of years ago. And number 1, that earthquakes were caused by angry gods or giant animals. Earthquakes are one of the most destructive natural disasters on the planet. And for centuries, people didn't understand what caused them. So they started blaming everything from angry gods to giant animals. For example, in China, people believed that earthquakes were caused by the movement of the dragon god. Meanwhile, in Japan, they believed that earthquakes were caused by the wrath of the sea god. What about the Greeks? Well, they blamed it on Poseidon, the god of the sea. As you can see, people's reasons for why earthquakes happen varied depending on where they lived. But nowadays, thanks to science, we know the truth. Earthquakes are caused by the shifting of tectonic plates. So that's all for now. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and share this video with fellow. Your support helps us bring you more captivating content like this. Thank you.